Hi, I'm Megan, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Andrew Palmer to our At Home with Literati series in support of The Bachelor. He will be in conversation with Rachel Monroe. For attendees, the chat is closed, but I'll be dropping links to purchase The Bachelor from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. A reminder that you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com, curbside pickup and ship it to your home anywhere in the United States, and we're also open for in-store shopping. Now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Andrew Palmer's writing has appeared in Times Literary Supplement and McSweeney's and on Slate, the Paris Review Online, and the New Yorker Online. He's been a fiction fellow at the Fine Arts Works Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and a resident at UCross and the Anderson Center. He grew up in Iowa and lives in Seattle with his partner and their dog. The Bachelor is his first novel. Rachel Monroe is a Texas-based writer whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and The Atlantic, where she is a contributing writer. First book, Savage Appetites, True Stories of Women, Crime, and Obsession, was a New York Times editor's choice and named the best book of the year by Esquire, the Chicago Tribune, and Jezebel.
All right. Hi, Rachel. So nice to be doing this event with you, and thanks to Literati too for hosting this. It's a real honor to read through your event series, and although I've never visited your store in person, would love to do so at some point in the future. It's also just nice for me to be reading via a Midwestern bookstore, since so much of this book takes place in the Midwest. So yeah, I think I will kick things off by reading a short passage from The Bachelor. Unless, Rachel, you have anything to say before I do that?
I don't.
All right, I'm going to jump in then. I'm going to read the last few pages of the first chapter. So just for a little context, the narrator of the book has just had an ambiguous sort of separation from his long-term girlfriend with whom he was living in Nova Scotia for a little while. And he's returning from Canada to the city where he grew up, Des Moines, Iowa, where he's going to be house sitting for a family friend for a bit. But on the way from Canada to Des Moines, he gets stranded in Detroit for a night. And so here the narrator is at a friend's house. He connected with an old friend, and he's spending the night at her house before he continues on to Iowa. So they're sitting in Maria's apartment, just drinking wine and talking. I don't have a clear memory of much of what Maria and I talked about the rest of the evening, but I vividly remember the sheen of saliva at the top of her bottom lip and the occasional appearance there of the tip of her tongue. And I was able to connect this appearance with something I'd never noticed in her before, a slight lisp, which either was becoming more pronounced the more we drank, or only seemed so because of my new awareness of its reality. Nothing is sexier than a lisp. Maria burnt popcorn in a frying pan and we ate it. Early New Order emanated from her laptop. We talked about New York, old friends, books. I or she opened another bottle of Indiana wine. I asked how her poetry was going, and she laughed and said it had been years since she'd written poetry. To retaliate, she asked what I was working on these days, and I said I was almost done with a novel based on the memoirs of my grandfather. Then, to balance my lie with the truth, I'd abandoned the novel less than halfway through a draft, or who knows why. I told her Ashwini had recently sold her debut. It was due out next spring. She's so talented, Maria said, and I agreed, though I was basing that judgment on a handful of stories. Ashwini had forbidden me to read her book until it was published and everyone could read it. You know it'll be about you, Maria said. We woke up fully clothed and holding each other in her bed, and then she was up and had made blueberry banana smoothies. While she was showering, I found a biography of the confessional poet John Berryman in one of her stacks. That is how I thought of him then, the confessional poet, John Berryman. For several years, I confused him with Wendell Berry, the righteous Kentucky farmer poet. Now I knew the difference, but I couldn't remember if I'd actually read any of Berryman's dream songs or only read about them. Either way, I had the feeling of liking them, their springy intensity, their schizoid exuberance. I examined the biography. dark suited, hands in pockets, reclining against a weathered wooden fence, a slender, young-looking, black and white Berryman gazed out at me from the cover, his narrow, handsome, half-shadowed face tensed in an expression of defiance or reproach. Beneath a thick mustache, his lips parted as if to say something, and without thinking, I opened the book. Berryman came over to see Miriam, I read, chatted with her, read her some of his dream songs, and was soon boasting of his sexual prowess. In spite of her protests, he began chasing her around the room. When she told him to get out, he suddenly became contrite and downcast and promised to be good if only he could stay. After a short while, however, he started again until he finally browbeat her into letting him spend 10 or 15 minutes reverently caressing her feet while reciting poetry. Then, realizing that the house had windows and that someone might be watching, Berryman recovered himself, hailed a taxi, and went home. The anecdote strained the limits of credibility, and I found myself wondering where it had come from, whether Berryman or Miriam, whoever Miriam was, or else some absent third party. I checked the back of the book for notes. There were none. Realizing that the house had windows. The sound of water against Maria's body had stopped, and I tucked the biography into my carry-on. Confessing my theft could be a good excuse to stay in touch with her, I thought vaguely. As Maria drove me back to the airport, she asked what I was working on these days. I paused to see if she'd remember asking me the night before, but when it became clear she didn't remember, I told her I was finishing another novel about my grandfather, like I'd told her the night before. "Oh God, did I ask you that last night?" she asked, in a voice that conveyed both exaggerated fear and sincere anxiety. "You didn't forget the entire evening," I said, "did you?" And while I hadn't meant to imply that we'd had sex, I discovered on my plane to Minneapolis, where 40 years earlier I was soon to read, Berryman had jumped from a bridge to his death, that I wasn't displeased with the implication. For a moment, I hoped she thought we might have. It thrilled me to imagine Maria thinking of me as someone who would sleep with another woman, her, just days after breaking off an engagement, even if that wouldn't have accurately characterized me if we actually had slept together. But no, it would be awful if she thought that. It was awful for her not to know what happened, what didn't happen, last night. I composed a clarifying text. I'd send it as soon as the plane touched down. Still, as I gazed through the faintly streaked window, I felt a little mysterious to myself, unmoored, a little dangerous. The places I had left seemed muted and distant. The snow-covered grid of the upper Midwest was blinding in the sun. I lowered the shade, closed my eyes, and thought about how lucky I was to live in an age of human flight. I fell asleep.
Thank you. I just had the experience of rereading this book, actually partially on an airplane, so it was fun. There were reading the airplane moments too, and one of the nicest things about rereading it, I'll say, is that I had this experience of, when you read a book that has like sharp and sort of fond and like amused, but like really precise observations about the world. Like I was like, oh, my perceptions are getting better in the week that I'm rereading this book. And the like journal that I obsessively keep, I was like, my journal is better this week because I'm reading Andrew's book. It's like something about it was like infiltrating my mind in like a really lovely and benevolent way. So I really appreciated that. And I'm excited for everybody else to have that experience too.
Thanks, that's so nice to hear. I'm happy to have influenced your journal in some way.
Yeah, it's cool. It's, because like sometimes it's just sort of like, this is what I'm anxious about. And then I was like, no, I don't know. I was just like seeing the world better because I had read your book. So that's like, it was a wonderful gift, and I'm very appreciative. What would John Berryman's season of The Bachelor have been like?
It would have been wild, I think, really, really wild. So John Berryman lived an incredibly tumultuous life. His father killed himself when he was 11 years old, and he was a raging alcoholic and a womanizer and had 3 wives, countless affairs throughout the course of his life. Was also just sort of like a real physical presence. He had this really long beard at the end of his life and was sort of tall and gangly. He was always falling over and like breaking things. I think that alone would have made for a compelling part of the season. I mean, part of what was interesting to me about pairing Berryman and The Bachelor was the sort of difference in vocabulary between the world of Berryman and the world of The Bachelor. It probably goes without saying that the vocabulary of The Bachelor, the TV show, is a lot more limited than the vocabulary that Berryman, who's this, really sort of virtuosic poet, had access to. And I was interested in setting those two sort of sets of language next to each other, particularly in the ways that Berryman talks about love and romance, both in his poems and in his letters to his many lovers. And it interested me to just sort of explore how the experience of love might be different if you had access to a sort of like wider range of modes of expression. Just reading Berryman's letters and poems was such a rich experience for me, because he is able to express himself in these sort of virtuosic ways. And then you go and watch The Bachelor, and it's like there are like 5 phrases which they repeat over and over again, and they're totally devoid of meaning. Opening up, right reasons, I'm on cloud 9, I'm falling for you. Like the language of love in that show is so limited. And you wonder to what degree that limits the actual experience of the contestants. At the same time, you do feel like watching the show that there is real emotion happening there. So anyway, if Berryman were on The Bachelor, he would really burst open those sort of cliches, I think, and open up this whole new world of Bachelor expressions, and it would be really exciting. And he'd also be falling over all the time, and there would be a certain degree of like physical humor, I think.
I could also imagine like the show, the like superstructure of the show being so strong that it would, even with a force as strong as Berryman, maybe it would like bend him to its will. And all of a sudden he'd just be like, I've never felt this way before.
Wow, this is a perfect night. I was on cloud 9. Totally.
I have to say, like reading you also like, despite the limited and very repetitive vocabulary of this show, which I am like a new convert to, you seem to, as a writer, gets like real genuine delight out of whatever play you're able to like achieve in it. I don't know, like there does seem to be like a real joy there.
Yeah, for sure. That was like at the very beginning of the process of writing this book, like one of the first things I did before I even knew I was going to write a novel that involved the TV show The Bachelor was just watch the season of The Bachelor that I'm writing about in the book. I think it's season 16, 2011, the second season starring Brad Womack, for those of you who are interested in accessing it. But just watching this season and just taking notes on it. And a lot of those notes were literally just like quotations from the show. And then I would experiment by just, instead of like writing, like I was on cloud 9, said Rachel, I would write like Rachel was on cloud 9, and writing that, like changing it from a first person quotation to a sort of close third person seemed to do something interesting. And there's a lot of passages in the book which use that technique and combine it with quotes from the show. It's just, it's funny and moving, I think, at the same time, to see these people trying to express these emotions, which are obviously really complicated emotions, and they're trying to figure out if they're real, to what extent they're real, to what extent they're being influenced by the cameras, and sort of like repurposing the language of The Bachelor in a literary context felt exciting to me. There's also like little moments of poetry, I think, accidental poetry, which come up in the show. Like when the lead says, you know, I feel like an idiot talking to you. You make me lose words. That's just like, that's sort of beautiful, you know? So it's a combination of factors, but I did find the language of the show really interesting.
I was talking to a reality TV producer guy recently, and I asked him, I had this idea in my head that, because I had recently been watching early seasons of America's Next Top Model, so early that it was like before all of the contestants had watched reality TV, so they sort of didn't know how to be on TV. So it's fascinating to watch, but it's actually like in some ways less good TV because they sort of don't know how to have a persona, which they are like projecting and describing the camera. So I was asking him, I was like, oh, has it gotten easier now that everybody's watching reality TV all the time to like make these shows? Because people sort of arrive in character almost in a way. And he was like, no, it's actually gotten much harder because what the audience really want, like the audience isn't stupid. The audience knows that these things are constructed and the little meta touches are part of the pleasure of them. But at the same time, what we all want to watch, what we all want to see as viewers is a moment that like cuts through that and does, despite all the artifice, feel real. And that it's actually harder because people are sort of giving the viewers what they think that they want, which is not actually what they want. And I was wondering, and maybe I was thinking about that when I was reading the novel. I was like, oh, the sort of moments of authenticity. And then I felt so embarrassed for having thought that, because I was like, oh no, authenticity, what an embarrassing thing to believe these days. But I guess I was just wondering if that, like, what is that something that as a writer you are aiming for, like a moment that sort of cuts through the artifice of like the novel, the fictional container that you're writing in, or is that like too naive of a way to be looking at it?
I mean, I definitely think that's something the novel is struggling towards and also like interrogating without like delivering any sort of definitive answers. So yeah, I mean, it's like, you're totally right that like reality TV shows, The Bachelor in particular, is so constructed. It's like so obviously unreal despite its genre category. And the people on the show, of course, understand that. The people watching at home, of course, understand that. And like you said, in spite of that, there are these moments where like reality seems to break through. And that's like, for me, like what's really interesting about watching The Bachelor in particular, because like the stakes, if you take them seriously, are so high. They're so high. Like the prize of this show is a lifetime with another person, theoretically. It doesn't always work out that way, of course, but I think like the success rate is a little bit higher than people tend to imagine, especially with the show The Bachelorette. It's like about 50% of the people who won are still with the leads. It's a lot lower on the Bachelor, which I'm sure says something about men versus women. But the stakes are real, and like there is a real component to it. And watching the show, you're sort of forced to think about the ways in which like your own life isn't authentic. I think, and like how the structures that we all are automatically dumped into by virtue of being born in a certain time and place are determinative of the lives that we lead. I mean, it's almost like so obvious that doesn't need to be said, but like I think that is definitely like something I wanted to explore by setting, you know, this sort of like first layer narrative of this book, the life of this narrator and all the people that he comes into contact with, against these sort of quasi characters on the reality TV show. And I do think, you know, one of the great things about the novel as a medium is that, like, it can offer a lot more, it just has a lot more ways to get at the feeling of reality or authenticity than, like, certainly reality TV, but also I think a lot of other mediums. There's just like a lot more subjectivity there. And so I wanted that contrast to be legible in the book, the sort of like stronger reality of the narrator's life and all the other characters when posed against the lives that are projected on the TV screen. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, definitely authenticity, like a central concern of the book. And yeah, I would hope that, like, that the book, I don't want to say like it reaches some sort of like higher plane of authenticity, but I do think it's sort of aiming for that.
Higher plane than The Bachelor?
Yeah.
But not
Well,
The Bachelorette.
But not The Bachelorette, exactly.
I have heard the argument, which I think is really interesting, that the Bachelor franchise is like accidentally a really good argument for polyamory, because you really do, you're like, oh, people, you really can fall in love with more than one person at a time. You watch it, you like literally watch it happening. And you're like, oh, and these relationships don't really take away from each other. The show, sort of the structure of the show, like can't acknowledge that. And so then it just forces them into like a traumatic shape of a relationship that seems to bum everybody out. I'm curious about the structure of the novel and how early you kind of settled on this shape, the shape that it takes. And maybe you can talk about like how you think of its structure, which I think is kind of quietly weird, I guess I would describe it.
Yeah, so for those who haven't read the book, there are sort of like, at least the way that I think of it, there are sort of three major elements to the book. And one is the TV show of The Bachelor as it unfolds over one season. Another is the life and works of this poet, John Berryman. And the third is the story of the narrator and all of the characters that he interacts with over the course of his narrative arc. And you know, from pretty early on, I knew that the narrator's story was going to in some way parallel the season of The Bachelor as it unfolded. There are 12 episodes of every season of The Bachelor, and so I was like, all right, there are going to be 12 chapters in this book, and each chapter there's going to be some sort of conversation between the TV show and this character's life. I didn't know like what form that would take at all, and it took a long time to figure out how that might work. Berryman came in soon after, and so then it was just a matter of like trying to find the right balance between the Berryman elements, the Bachelor elements, and the sort of top layer narrative elements. And again, it just took a lot of like trial and error to figure out like what would work. But I think that the sort of like the first part of the book is more Bachelor heavy. It's more about the narrator discovering the show, thinking about its structure, its forms and modes, and the Berryman stuff comes in more strongly, I think, towards the end. And one of the reasons that ultimately felt right to me was because Berryman's story is like so dark. It's so really tragic in a lot of ways, and I wanted that darkness to sort of infiltrate both the story of the narrator and the story of the Bachelor, because while The Bachelor is super fun and frothy and you know, just like sort of a delight to watch a lot of the time, I also think it's like really sad and dark at its heart. Just the way in which the contestants are being commodified and objectified and used in the way that they use one another. The way that their emotions are sort of deliberately toyed with by the producers of the show and then sold to millions of people like me and you, Rachel, who just scoop it up. It's really, it's really sad, even as I can't stop watching. And so sort of emphasizing Berriman's self-destructive impulses, his sort of like self-loathing, I think sort of like the implicit threat of violence in his life, both self-violence and violence towards others, seem to draw out a theme in like heterosexual monogamous American romance, which I felt present both in The Bachelor and in the narrator's relationships to a certain extent. I'm not sure the narrator understands that fully, but I think the book understands it a little bit better than he does. And so by sort of like weighting the back end of the book with this sort of dark Berriman material, I wanted to sort of put a point on that theme of violence a little bit. But yeah, it was like a big challenge for me in writing this book was, figuring out how to thread those three elements successfully. And I don't know how well it works, but it sort of just ended up feeling right to me, the way that it worked out.
It seems to me that there's like another element too which is, well, I'd have to go back and maybe chart it a little bit more, but my feeling is that as the book progresses, we sort of start with the narrator alone in this house, and it's very much his feelings of being in the house and his memories. And then as the book progresses, there are more and more as he's meeting other people, most of them like women who are some sort of potential romantic prospect, like their story, it becomes like almost like this Rachel Cusk thing that happens where their stories, these women's stories take up more and more space in the book. And I guess I'm just curious to hear you talk about like what those stories, which are neither the Bachelor, the narrator, or Berriman's story, what space they occupy for you, and what sort of are they? Is it a counter narrative? Is it what are they doing in there?
Yeah, I think that like the narrator is at a point in his life where he is like really having a lot of questions about who he is. Like he's sort of like his identity is like sort of like dissolving in a way that he can't quite figure out. He's on the heels of this sort of quasi breakup. He has published one novel, but has sort of decided to stop writing fiction for the time being, and so he's giving up that part of his identity as well. And so this is leaving him in a moment in his life. And there is definitely, I think, a parallel here to Cusk's books, which I didn't read until after writing the bulk of this book. But, I think like in the wake of like I don't want to call it a trauma exactly, but like some bad stuff happening in your life, you can sort of feel like, who am I? And with that comes like, I think the potential to open yourself in a new way to the stories of other people. And so that's how I sort of see that happening with the narrator, as like a listener and the imbiber of other people's stories. He half intentionally is like opening himself up to these stories and allowing them to sit inside him in a way that I think gives him space to like ask some questions about his own life and try to figure out what the next steps are for himself. So yeah, I feel like all these stories sort of like infiltrating the narrator's life are a direct result of where the narrator is in his own life.
Yeah, and it seems like much like on The Bachelor, everybody's, or maybe just in life in general, we're always trying to sort of narrate ourselves to ourselves and to other people, and trying out what feels right or or misaligned or true with one person and then not true with somebody else. And that sort of feels like what he's navigating. And were you thinking of writing a Midwestern book? Does it feel like, is that an important part of the book's identity to you?
Yeah, I think it is. Like, I don't know. I've never really read a novel set in Des Moines, which is my hometown. And so like there was a part of me that was just like, I want to bring glory, literary glory upon this neglected city and region. But I mean, the other thing was like, it felt like a nice contrast to have at least the first part of the narrator's story unfolding in Des Moines as he watched this very California story unfold on the screen. The sort of contrast between, especially winter in the Midwest and like sunny California, just I think added a touch of irony or humor or something to the paralleling of those stories. And then when the narrator does end up traveling to California in the second half of the book, it's a sort of this almost like realization of a fantasy world for him. Even though I wanted to feel real, totally realistic within the confines of his narrative. It's this sort of ascension, literally, to the top of a mountain and entering into a world which is so far removed from the world of Des Moines. But yes, the Midwesternness of the book felt exciting to me and also just useful.
Are there no other Des Moines books?
I'm sure there are, and I just haven't read them. The one that I know is a Bill Bryson book, because Bill Bryson is the one like famous writer from Des Moines. It's not a novel, and I can't remember the title of the one that does talk about Des Moines, but it's really patronizing about it.
Yeah, that's his mode. He only writes about things as if he like is full of contempt for them.
Yeah, and I didn't want that because I don't feel contempt for Des Moines. I feel ambivalent towards it, definitely, but I think it's worthy of attention.
Did you learn anything about it through writing about it? Did you come to anything?
That's a good question. I don't know that I did, except that it did sort of like deepen my tender feelings toward it. I didn't write any of it in Des Moines, and it was just pleasant to imaginatively re-enter that space while I was away from it. I think like growing up in Des Moines, it did seem like sort of a place to escape for me. But having escaped it and been away from it for many years, it's like, oh no, actually there are a lot of like really positive elements to this place. And the narrator talks about that a little bit in the book. So I do think like it made me understand on a deeper level, like how okay Des Moines was compared to other places, at least.
There's something the narrator says about The Bachelor, which I think is like totally apt, that one of the structures of that show is that you progress to a certain point and then everybody starts like revealing their traumas, like their one traumatic, the saddest story that ever happened to them or whatever. Mm-hmm. And the sort of position of the show is that like everybody has one trauma, which you like preferably talk about on the one-on-one, and you cry, and the other person is like, this just makes me like you even more, or I think that's like consistently the line. Mm-hmm. And there's like a little bit in the book too. There's like a little bit of a thread of a question mark about trauma. Like, is it traumatic? Is trauma necessary? I guess like for a good story, I guess would be maybe like one of the questions that I felt. Mm-hmm. was underlying there in a book. Do you need to like have a bad childhood to have an interesting childhood?
Right.
And I guess I'm just curious, like what you're thinking about that was as you were putting this together, and also like in terms of narrative, does like a narrative need a trauma?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
he pushed.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that's definitely one of the central questions of the book, and something the narrator is concerned with, because he is someone who has led like a pretty pleasant life up until the moment where he is in the book. He's 29 for most of the story. And life has just sort of like sailed along pretty nicely for him. He had a happy childhood and published a book pretty early, achieved a little bit of success with that. And so, yeah, I think it comes back to this question of identity, sort of like trying to figure out like, there's this question on The Bachelor, which recurs not only on the season that I write about, but on all seasons, or most seasons that I've seen anyway, which is, what makes you you? That's a question that like contestants are continually asking each other. And yeah, usually the answer to that question is like something really, really bad that happened to me, either when I was a kid or more recently. So it's like, oh, my fiance died in a plane crash, or my wife died of cancer a couple of years ago, or someone else close to me died, or like my father abandoned me when I was a kid. And when a contestant on The Bachelor doesn't have one of those stories, it's sort of like weird. It's like there's a hole in their identity. And so the narrator's sort of like thinking through these questions. Another character at one point suggests that he write something about his own life, and he's like, what do I have to write about? I've just been like boring, mildly positive life with a few like minor sad moments. So I think it was just like interesting to me to explore that question. Like, is a story, what kind of story would it be to tell sort of like the life story of someone who hasn't had a major trauma? Like, so there can't be this redemptive story arc. It's just sort of like the unfolding of a life, which is, I think, how a lot of lives are up until a certain point. Another thing I would say, like, is that like, I think one thing that the narrator sort of starts to realize is that really what those tragic backstories are getting at is like a sense of the loss that is at the heart of all lives, no matter what. Like, people just, it goes without saying, go through life and they lose people close to them. And they grow older and they get sick and eventually they die. It's all about like things sort of, it's not all about, but it's largely about things disappearing from your life. And that's true whether or not you have this sort of like major focal point of trauma. And so the narrator, partly because he's returning to his childhood home, is sort of like thinking a lot about his childhood and comparing his present day circumstances to previous times in his life. And he's feeling really intensely, I think, like a sense of loss without there being anything like really terrible happening in his life. And so I think that can be true, and sort of like have the same emotional valence as like this one big central sad story.
Right. It's sort of a feeling that's harder to organize in a way without
Totally.
without that sort of prescribed shape to it.
Mm-hmm.
I got a couple more questions for you, but then we're going to go to the Q&A. So if anybody has questions that are burbling up in their head, you can type them in the Q&A, and then I will ask them to Andrew. What was your favorite part of the book to write?
It was, I would say it's maybe a tie between some of the Bachelor sections and some of the Berryman sections. Like, as I said before, just like transcribing dialogue from The Bachelor is like a really fun activity to like read it on the page gives it an entirely different feeling than to hear it or to see it on screen, I think. And doing that was just sort of like both like really easy, somewhat mindless, but also fun to organize it and turn it into a sort of like, poetry of a sort. that was really fun, but also like, and this is like harder, but also fun. I did a ton of research on Berryman and read multiple biographies of him, visited his archives at the University of Minnesota, and just collected like reams of material about him. Most of which obviously didn't make it into the book, but like doing that research and sort of like figuring out what was going to have some resonance in the stories that I was telling was rewarding and interesting to me. So it was sort of like finding the themes and stories that like would produce interesting echoes with the narrator's story or the Bachelor's story was pretty fun.
And what was the hardest part to write?
The hardest part was just figuring out like the central story of the narrator. I like had no idea what it would be at the beginning of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just like, it just took a long time to imagine, I think. And there were a lot of false starts and a lot of periods where I just had to set it aside for a while until like something came to me. Because like ultimately, like I care about the story, the sort of central plot of the book, and I hope that it pulls the reader along. But really, I just want it to be like a pathway through a set of stories, like I said, that are bouncing up against each other, and a set of ideas and images and themes. And so I sort of think of that part of the book as just like a path which the reader can walk through and think about life, I suppose.
Now we went to grad school together. I'm curious if there's anything that we were told in grad school which like was echoing in your head as you were writing this, or were you like, they didn't teach us anything? They only taught us to write short stories. They taught us something, but it's nothing that would be helpful to anybody writing a novel.
Yeah, I mean, well, hopefully none of our teachers are here watching this, because what I'm about to say, I guess, doesn't necessarily reflect well on them, but I don't think they were bad teachers. I just like, I don't remember much of anything from what we learned in grad school. I did a lot of writing and experimenting, and I feel like it was useful in that way. But there was not anything that any professor said that was echoing in my head as I wrote this. So I'm very grateful for that time, and I thank my teachers for all the time that they put in, for sure.
Are you working on another thing now?
I'm in the very early stages of a new novel. Yeah, it's so early that it's probably best not to talk too much about it. But yeah, I'm excited to dig deeper into it.
We have a comment here from Terry Blackman who says 100 Days in Deadland by Rachel Ox is set in Des Moines and apparently features zombies.
Oh, there you go.
Do you know, you know this book?
What's that?
You don't know this book?
I don't know it, but I'll have to pick it up.
Okay. I think that is, so you haven't necessarily written the great Des Moines novel, or at least you have a rival.
For sure, yeah. Hopefully this inspires other people to tell their Des Moines stories too. You know, that would be a nice outcome of this book.
Now, I know I have this thing where like once I write about something, then particularly through the process of publishing a book, which is like a long process, by the time the book or article comes out, I'm like thoroughly sick of the thing and like moved on to the next thing. Do you have like residual affection, preoccupation with either Berryman or the Bachelor show within you, or do you feel like you worked through whatever it was you were working through?
I would say with Berryman and the Bachelor, I think I've worked through what it was that I've had to work through. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that feeling of sort of being sick of the world that I imaginatively inhabited, I think has like happened a few different times during the course of the writing process. But then I'll feel that feeling and then return to it and feel like, oh, like it's nice to come back to this and again live in this world. So I feel like right now I'm at a moment where like it's not so bad to be back in this world and to be exploring it a little more. But I wouldn't say there's going to be a sequel that's like the parts of Berryman's life that I didn't write about in here and like the next season of The Bachelor.
Was it Berryman's life or his writing? Or is that sort of a false dichotomy that was preoccupying you, do you think?
It was both, but I was really like, what really spurred me to write about him was reading a biography of him and feeling a similar feeling to the feeling that I feel sometimes when I watch The Bachelor, which is that here are these real people doing real things, but trapped in these constructs. And reading this biography of Berryman, which I thought was a not very well-written biography of Berryman, I sort of had that same feeling, like Berryman, all these people in Berryman's life are trapped in this, really artificial construct. Biography is a genre with its own codes and aesthetic, like any other genre. And it just felt like a sort of injustice was being done to him, and to everyone else in his life. And I was interested in sort of like playing with that and seeing if like there was a realer Berryman which I could somehow draw out. And I don't even know if that's actually possible for anyone to do, but I do think like there are certain like modes of storytelling which tend to sort of almost automatically dehumanize the people that are at the center of their stories. Yeah, how do you think about that, Rachel? Because you're always writing about real people, or you're often writing about real people and sort of telling other people's stories. Like, how are you concerned about getting at their authentic selves or representing them in what feels like a fair way?
I guess that I would say authentic, who knows that, I usually am not spending a ton of time with these people, much less time than you would be spending with Berryman, even, you never met him personally, but like through the letters honestly, like less time than I've spent with Matt James, the previous Bachelor, in many cases, considering those episodes are still long. So I guess I don't, it would feel presumptuous to talk about it being authentic, but fair, I guess, seems important, depicting a person in a way that aligns with how they see themselves. Feels important. I'm working on an ethically thorny one right now, so this is very much in my head. Particularly about a person who seems to like have no concern at all about how he's portrayed. Like the least self-conscious person I've ever met. And that's confusing to know how to work with.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I just don't like it when they confess crimes to me while I'm being a reporter. I'm just like, don't say that, buddy. Don't tell me about your mail fraud.
That does sound hard. Yeah. That's something that I haven't had to deal with. And I guess is one of the advantages of writing fiction is that you're not necessarily interacting with real people.
Well, but you're with somebody like Berryman who does have this history of look at it like through one slant, and who could be portrayed as like abusive, misogynist, addict, like pathetic. There's like plenty there that you have to figure out how to reckon with, but also not let it take over, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. And there are people who obviously knew him who are still alive, and so I don't know. There was, I think, an ethical component to me for me writing this, which not all fiction writers necessarily have to deal with, because there's the potential. I mean, I had to request permission from Berryman's late third wife to include all the quotations that I include in the book. And she was really generous about that. But like,
Did you have to send her the book?
no, I just told her like I just gave her a summary of what it was about and the stuff that I wanted to include, and she was like, go for it.
What would you have done if she had? Were you worried that?
Oh, I was super worried. Yeah, I mean, that was like a paralyzing thought to me for a long time. I would have had to paraphrase like all that stuff and maybe just rework some of those sections. But I really like so much of his writing, and also his correspondence, his lover's writing, Beryl. And so I really wanted to include those passages. But yeah, no, it's tough. Like even if I think that the narrator's sort of understanding of Berryman is, or his portrayal of him is both sympathetic and like acknowledging that he's a very problematic figure. And it's just hard to get that dimensionality into a picture of a person, and try not to come down too hard on any one side, but just try to give an accurate representation of who they were.
Would you consider your book a romantic comedy?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to own that. Yeah. Yeah. Do you think it is?
It's funny, and I feel like the cover is going in that direction. I did look at some of your Goodreads reviews, which are either like high praise or people being like, I'm a big fan of The Bachelor, the TV show. I don't understand like what's going on here.
Yeah.
And so I guess we expect out of a rom-com is like a certain comforting formulaic shape, which you do not deliver.
No. It's more, I would say it's more in the mode of like the Richard Linklater before movies, where there's more ambiguity and ambivalence in the relationships, but there's still a lot of like walking around and chatting about love.
Yeah. Which is my favorite thing about the Bachelorette, actually, honestly, is just, well, all of them, like how much they make men cry and like talk about love and feelings.
Yeah.
As a not a like gendered thing that anybody wants, but just a TV human desire.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's what makes, I think The Bachelorette is more interesting than The Bachelor most of the time.
Yeah, agreed.
For that reason.
Well, I'm going to say that this is, audience, your last chance to ask a probing question. And if there aren't any, is there anything that you feel compelled to tell us all?
No, I'm happy to end the conversation here. Yeah.
Have you enjoyed the publishing process?
Yeah, no, it's been good. It's been really fun to work with my team at Hogarth, and this week has been nice. It's weird to do everything virtually, but it's really great to imagine the book like sort of spreading across the country and like making its way into bookstores here and there and into readers' hands. So that's, yeah, it's cool. It's like surreal still, and I don't think the reality is fully hit me, but it's been nice.
Have you gotten to see it in the wild yet?
Only at my local bookstore here in Seattle, Elliott Bay, where I went in and signed some books, and then photos of it elsewhere. But yeah, it's definitely cool to like see it on the shelf. I especially like seeing it like, because it's on display in a couple places, but it's also like in the fiction shelves and like sort of situated where it's going to be shelved, for as long as it is shelved in bookstores. And I sort of like it just quietly hanging out there. with its neighbors. It's right next to Grace Paley, which I like.
Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, it's cool.
Well, congratulations.
Thanks, Rachel.
It looks like we've reached the top of the hour. Andrew Palmer and Rachel Monroe, thank you for joining us on At Home with Literati tonight. And thanks to our viewers as well. Make sure to buy the book. The link is in the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Literati.